Good evening, everyone. My name is Abdullah Al-Aryan. I'm a professor of Middle East history here at Georgetown University in Qatar. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. Your presence, whether here in Doha, in Washington, or for those joining us from around the world, serves as a testament to the fact that the question of Palestine is one that concerns us all. And yet it must be said that in the face of an unfolding genocide that today enters its second month and continues to shock the conscience with the scale of the destruction and devastation being inflicted on Palestinians, a gathering such as this can feel woefully insufficient. But I would suggest that today's event is particularly important in not only educating ourselves, but in recognizing how our discussion here might inform the efforts to bring about an end to the current violence. This past weekend saw perhaps the largest mass protests in recent history in support of Palestinians. And yet the so-called international community, a euphemism that refers primarily to the United States, European former colonial powers, and the United Nations, an institution where these states maintain veto power, refused to heed the demands of tens of millions of people for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the blockade of Gaza. Indeed, from the time that Arthur Balfour declared the intentions of the most powerful empire in the world to establish a colonial project in Palestine, an event, it should be said, whose 106th anniversary we just marked last week, international law has been consistently invoked to enable the colonization and ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as witnessed during the League of Nations mandate. The era of the United Nations has not fared much better, as dozens of UN resolutions addressing the rights of Palestinian refugees, the occupation and its violent enforcement, along with the 2004 ruling by the International Court of Justice on the apartheid wall, have all gone unenforced. More to the point, the overwhelming number of war crimes committed by Israel have claimed the lives of over 10,000 Palestinians in the past month, leading many exacerbated people of conscience to wonder, where is international law? To help educate us on this question, we're fortunate to have with us Wadie Said, a senior visiting fellow at Georgetown in Qatar, who we're grateful to have with us for the next couple of weeks. Wadie comes to us from the University of Colorado School of Law, where he is professor of law and the Dean's Faculty Fellow. Previously, he was professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law, as well as an assistant federal public defender. Professor Said teaches courses in criminal law and procedure and human rights. He's also the author of Crimes of Terror, the legal and political implications of federal terrorism prosecutions, as well as many other works dealing with the intersection of criminal law, international law, immigration law, and foreign policy. We're also fortunate to have this event co-sponsored by our DC campus partners, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. Following the talk, we'll open it up to some questions from our audience here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Said.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I wanted to thank at the outset Dean Mustry for inviting me and Professor Al-Aryan for the kind introduction, as well as the staff here at Georgetown University, Qatar, for their warm welcome and for making this event possible. Now, this is a bit of a difficult talk to give, not simply because of the seriousness and sadness of the destruction in Gaza, but also because of the fact that I personally tend to speak on topics in the law, usually American criminal law, not exclusively. But my talks tend to reference politics in some way or form, but usually that form involves the law's attempt to criminalize what it refers to as terrorism, with all that brings with unresolved vagueness, etc. After all, even now, there's still not a universally recognized definition of terrorism, even if its general parameters are somewhat recognizable to all. I think maybe a fair attempt at a definition is violence against civilians with the aim of coercing a government to change its policies in some way. That's not a complete definition, and it leaves a great deal of questions unanswered, but that's generally speaking sort of where I try to make a contribution, try to make an intervention. I bring this up because what I usually do is end up discussing the ramifications of politically inflected laws and prosecutions, and then I try to draw conclusions accordingly. This is what I probably shouldn't be admitting, but is a kind of a naturally conservative approach, because I'm usually rigid in the conclusions that I draw, supported by evidence from the cases and statutes under discussion. In the current situation, we're looking at war, specifically the armed forces of a nation-state relentlessly shelling and attacking a small piece of land whose 2.3 million inhabitants are stateless, with the large majority, 70%, being refugees registered as such with the United Nations. It is clear how and when this current round of fighting began, but even though in certain quarters asking that we look, and I refer principally to the context in which from which I've just come, the American context, where we look at the wider context of what is occurring in Palestine, that's regarded as some sort of apologia for terrorism. Well, I guess I'm going to ask that we look at that context anyway. After all, the current death toll in Gaza stands at over 10,000, well over 2/3 of them women and children, which matters, by the way. It's not just repeating a point. It matters because, as we're going to see in the law, when we're talking about making these calculations, as unseemly as it might sound, those populations, women and children, are not generally considered fighters for the purposes of the laws of war. We also see that 70% of the population in the Gaza Strip is internally displaced. Some 88 United Nations staff members have been killed. That's the largest number of those killed in a conflict in many decades. Over 30 journalists killed, many mosques destroyed, churches targeted. All 11 universities in the Gaza Strip have been attacked. Many bakeries have been wiped out. I could go on, and I'm sure you all follow the news. So I guess now I might insert the question of what role does the law play here? Okay, here I'll be discussing three sources of law: international law, American law, and Israeli. Not in an exhaustive manner, okay? Not in an exhaustive manner, but in a kind of an attempt to piece together some sort of legal analysis that I think is necessary here, even if it is limited in its potential for seeing a breakthrough on any humanitarian or principled basis to the current war. But first, if I could, a word on credibility, which matters for our discussion. We all know that the United States and Israel consider Hamas, along with the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine and Hezbollah, to be terrorist organizations. Okay. In 1996, the United States Congress passed a law that allowed for the State Department to categorize groups as, and this is an acronym that's used, foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs. And in doing so, in Congress passing such a law, it allowed the State Department, or specifically the Secretary of State, to make these designations based on a finding by Congress that, quote, foreign organizations that engage in terrorist activity are so tainted by their criminal conduct that any contribution to such an organization facilitates that conduct. Now, as a result of this, Congress criminalized the provision of what is called material support to these FTOs. Now, for those of you who might be slightly masochistic, I will talk about that in my talk next week about American law in Palestine. But from the current active fighting scenario, we can see easily how the American government and the press extend this logic to credibility. It's as if they're saying that Hamas and the other Palestinian groups are so tainted by their violent conduct that anything they say or claim, or anyone perceived to be affiliated with those groups says or claims, is de facto suspect. Okay? Now, critically here, from that perspective, right, the Israeli side suffers from no such defect, even though its track record of obfuscation and deception is plain for all to see. So this slams headlong into reality. All right? And I bring up this issue of credibility because it'll affect the legal analysis to follow. So, for example, you remember, I'm sure, recently that President Biden questioned the Palestinian casualty count. Okay? The President of the United States, the militarily strongest country in the history of the world, right, getting into an argument with medical workers in the Gaza Strip. It's a very symmetrical, right? It's an interesting look. And they, of course, the medical workers in Gaza, the Hamas-affiliated medical workers in Gaza, produced a list of everyone who had been killed. That's what we've been reduced to watching. But the point was made. These people, the Hamas-affiliated people, have no credibility, is what the message seemed to be. We also saw that with the bombing of the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital, right? The other side did it. The other team did it, the President of the United States said, okay? Telling us what team he was on, by the way, right? So, again, who's credible? The people who are being bombed with the most modern weaponry in human history, or the people doing the bombing, okay? It's an interesting point, too, because you can say what you want or think what you want about the Hamas movement, but I don't know that they really suffer, even though the Western press and Western governments seem to have accepted this. I don't know that they suffer from a crisis of credibility. If you follow their statements, which I do, I know that maybe this is the point. Maybe we shouldn't be following their statements. But when they say they're going to do something, they do it, right? When they say they've done something, they tend to show the proof. This is important because when you start looking at what the law says and the laws of war about who's a civilian, right? What's a legitimate target? If the other side is so tainted by their conduct that they have no credibility, well then, bombs away. It seems to be the message, as crude as that sounds. Okay? So a few words on the law here. The laws of war, also called somewhat, in my view, contradictorily, international humanitarian law, have some key provisions, two of which are principles that I feel are relevant here. Those are the principles of distinction and proportionality. With respect to distinction in an armed conflict, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, require that warring parties make a real attempt to distinguish between civilian and military targets. Okay? This is the principle of distinction. One of the main things you hear Israeli spokespeople and their allies in other governments say is, and they say this frequently, is that they do not target civilians, okay? They do not target civilians. The implication, of course, which goes unstated, and then when it actually goes stated, it's taken as a fact that cannot be challenged, is that the other side, of course, targets civilians, okay? Now, given the level of death and destruction the Israelis have wrought in the Gaza Strip over the last month, I have a hard time accepting the statement that they don't target civilians, okay? And I don't think that's particularly controversial. Why is this important? Now, just think about the general principles of criminal law, just in general, okay? There's a parallel here. When you look at the state of mind necessary for committing a crime, culpability falls along the following lines. In that someone, in the context of murder or killing, homicide, someone who kills intentionally someone who kills someone else intentionally is seen as the most culpable. That's the worst kind of killing, okay, than someone who kills, say, knowingly or recklessly. All right. So we see here in the discussion that the saying that one group targets civilians intentionally kind of tracks with our general understanding of what the law criminalizes. The intentional killer is worse than the knowing killer or the reckless killer. In the context of war, I would say that maybe we should revisit this, okay? As a general matter, I could say, I can't really argue with this concept as a legal principle, but I can also say that taking Israeli claims not to target civilians at face value and in good faith, which is a leap, but let me try to do it and assume that, I still think it's time to maybe reevaluate this standard. Okay? When one side possesses weapons that can kill large numbers of people consistently and uses them in a highly built-up populated area repeatedly to the point where many, many, many more Palestinians die than are killed by so-called deliberate or intentional Palestinian attacks, we might ask the point of such a standard. This brings up another issue, okay, which I'm sure you've probably encountered or at least given some thought to, okay? This is the classic conundrum of terrorism versus state violence in the anti-colonial context. And in the United States, it's very controversial now to talk about this situation as Palestinians engaging in an anti-colonial type of struggle. It's become controversial. Forgive me if I don't succumb to that temptation to find it controversial. I think it's relatively clear. Here I'd ask, and I think I want to kind of bring up an interesting moment from my past when I'm sure many of you have heard of my father. And so one of the many things he exposed me to was a filmmaker by the name of Gillo Pontecorvo, an Italian director. He ended up took a family trip one year, but we didn't get to go to Rome, why he did, to go interview Pontecorvo. I felt particularly cheated by that. But Pontecorvo made a film, a very famous film called The Battle of Algiers, which some of you may have seen. And the Battle of Algiers talks about, I think it was during the Algerian War of Independence, 1904 to 1962. I think the Battle of Algiers was 1957, if I'm not wrong. But there was a particular incident or series of incidents when the FLN, the National Liberation Front of Algeria, fought a battle against French troops in the city of Algiers. And one of the things that the movie depicts quite openly is how the Algerian FLN operatives would do things like take a bag filled with explosives, a purse, and leave it at a disco, and it would blow up and kill, French Algerians. And the classic scene in the movie comes where the French won the Battle of Algiers, by the way, but they, of course, as you know, lost the war when they pulled out of Algeria a few years later. So basically, the commander of the FLN cell in the Kasbah in Algiers gets captured, and he gets paraded before the French media. And they ask him, how can you justify sending people, putting bombs in discotheques and cafes and things like that? And he says, I'll tell you what, you give me your airplanes and tanks and artillery, and I'll give you my bombs in handbags at discotheques, okay? Is that the right answer? Is that morally correct? I don't know, but I do know that is the conundrum, and that is the actual dynamic that we face, okay? And it continues to be made over and over. And just to give you an idea about the the contested nature of this and the actual potential for misunderstanding, the American military, right, the whole point of the Battle of Algiers as a movie was to show an anti-colonial struggle in a particular context, to show that even though the French could win the Battle of Algiers by capturing everyone and torturing everyone in the FLN cell and bringing down houses over the heads of the FLN, at the same time, what happened? They lost the war. Interestingly, the American military, in the context of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, they showed the Battle of Algiers to the troops, not for the message that Pontecorvo intended, and everyone else who I know who's ever watched intended, but to teach the American military how to fight a counterinsurgency campaign in an asymmetrical war. So here we have a kind of an encapsulation of the problem we're facing now, where Palestinians and their supporters believe that they are fighting against a state that wants to erase their existence in the most brutal ways, and they feel their cause is just. Meanwhile, a whole host of forces are arrayed against them that try to insist that they are, in fact, a bunch of violent, bloodthirsty terrorists. Okay, so that's a little bit of an aside, but I think it gives us an idea of where we are. Getting back to the law, there were these 2 points from international law: distinction, proportionality. So on distinction here, I'd like to point out an important article written by a philosophy professor, Muhammad Ali Khaldi, who now teaches at the City University of New York. He wrote this article in the Journal of Palestine Studies. And he wrote, in the wake of the 2008-2009 attack on Gaza, there have been, unfortunately, quite a few, dubbed Operation Cast Lead by the Israeli military. And in this article, he pointed out that in 2005, the Israeli military commissioned a code of ethics by a philosopher named Asa Kasher and a former high-ranking military officer named Amos Yadlin. This code broke new ground in that it told Israeli soldiers they should prioritize their own lives over that of Palestinian civilians. The result is the following, and I'm going to quote at length from Muhammad Ali's article. He writes, quote, "The argument made in this paper implies that some of the deliberate acts of violence carried out against Palestinian civilians by Israeli military forces during Operation Cast Lead, 2008-2009, can be traced directly to the ethical code officially approved by the Israeli military to govern the so-called fight against terror and promulgated at the highest levels of the Israeli military command. Whereas deliberate violence against civilians is classified as a war crime under international humanitarian law, a widespread attack on a civilian population that is, quote, pursuant to or in furtherance of a state or organizational policy to commit such attack, that can be classified instead as a crime against humanity, an even greater crime." So, this is the code of ethics in effect for the Israeli military that effectively elides the principle of distinction. So basically giving Israeli troops carte blanche in their own code of ethics to not distinguish between civilian and military target. I haven't heard one pundit, analyst, government official, etc., make reference to this. Okay? This is chilling. Further, the code is also clear that Palestinians have no right to fight back against Israelis, including, and it says it very clearly, including against soldiers. So I'm sure some of you, again, are aware of this context, but in 2007, you know that the Israelis declared a blockade of Gaza. Okay. In doing so, they actually, because the Israeli government is quite, I think, adept at using the law for its purposes, they made a finding or made a declaration that they considered Gaza to be a terrorist entity, meaning they could target them but they're not allowed to fight back. They never have accepted, the Israelis have never accepted the idea that Palestinians be allowed to resist militarily or armed or engage in armed resistance to occupation. Okay, let's bear that in mind. Let's bear that in mind as we go forward. Now, turning to this rule of proportionality, the rule in war is that even if there is a clear military target, it is not possible to attack it if the expected harm to civilians or civilian property is excessive in relation to the expected military advantage. So one thing that in some of the sources that I've been looking at, where I've looked at kind of legal scholars and commentators talking about the laws of war, and they point out the laws of war don't say that civilians can't be killed, okay? They don't say that civilians can't be killed, just that the attack be proportional, okay? Now, admittedly, this is difficult to apply, but it is enough to ask how proportional is this current attack on Gaza, even bearing in mind the acts of October 7th, okay? So just today, on Al Jazeera, Wa'il al-Dahdouh, the Al Jazeera correspondent who lost his wife and 2 children as well as a grandchild in a recent Israeli bombing, he says the bombing is only geared to hurt the civilian population. How come? Everybody knows that the Hamas leaders and fighters are underground. This bombing isn't touching them, okay? This bombing isn't touching them. How proportional is it? Okay? You don't believe Wa'il al-Dahdouh? I've seen even after his family was killed, certain people wrote about, in the press, they write that some of his family members were in the jihad movement and he's well known to be connected to militants. Okay. How about Raji Sourani, the leading Palestinian human rights lawyer? A few weeks ago, his house was destroyed in an Israeli airstrike in, as he put it, the most beautiful area of Gaza in the Rimal corridor, Tel al-Hawa area. He said, look, whatever else this airstrike accomplished other than destroying my beautiful house with its lovely garden, it didn't hurt Hamas. He said, they're still intact. Everybody knows they're there. Everybody knows where they are. They're functioning like a Swiss watch. If these people know it, don't you think the Americans and the Israelis and everyone else knows it? Including the international press, but they ignore what the Israelis do and the situation on the ground. And they engage in, and I hate to speak I don't want to be kind of sloppy and speak in a kind of collective, oh, they say this, they say that. But actors here try to, some of the people I'm referring to or the entities I'm referring to maybe blend together. But Israelis and their supporters, including in the press, they employ kind of what I would call not really based in facts or reality type of conventional wisdom. Let's take one. Hamas uses human shields, okay? Everybody says that, okay? Even today, I think the UN Secretary General said it, okay, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken, so if I am, don't sue me, okay? But let's look at this. Hamas uses human shields. All right. There have been, as we know, many attacks on Gaza by the Israelis over the last 15 or so years. Let's look at what Amnesty International had to say in the 2014 conflict between the Israelis and Gaza. So it wrote in a report, Amnesty International is monitoring and investigating such reports that Hamas uses human shields, but does not have evidence at this point that Palestinian civilians have been intentionally used by Hamas or Palestinian armed groups during the current hostilities to shield specific locations or military personnel or equipment from Israeli attacks. Under international humanitarian law, this is the critical point, even if human shields are being used, Israel's obligations to protect these civilians would still apply, okay? So even if they're using civilians as human shields, international law would still apply. They can't just target them willy-nilly. Now, I think you know, because I told you, or at least I hope you believe me, that I'm no military expert. But if that was in 2014, and we all see how much the Palestinian group's military capabilities have grown, as well as the fact that they have a 500-kilometer series of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip, which by all reports seem to have not been damaged in this prolonged attack, it doesn't look like those groups are using civilians as human shields. In fact, the Israeli military actually had a practice of using Palestinian civilians as human shields. What they would do is they would conduct a raid, and they would, for example, have a target they were trying to arrest or otherwise eliminate. They'd send a Palestinian child to go and try to entice that person to come out. This was an actual practice. Okay? People sued, victims of this practice sued, and the matter came before the Israeli Supreme Court in 2010. The court there, to its credit, ruled the policy is illegal. What did the military do? It protested. It said, we want to continue using this practice of using Palestinian civilians as human shields when we conduct raids. Okay. Now, despite the decision, there are still documented cases of Israeli military using human shields. In fact, a recent report by Defense of Children International Palestine, which, by the way, the Israeli authorities tried to say was basically affiliated with a terrorist group and shut them down last year. That, of course, turned out to be not true. But anyway, Defense for Children International Palestine documents the use of 5 children this year alone as human shields by the Israeli military. Okay. The human shields argument I find to be particularly pernicious in the Palestinian case because we see it kind of constantly coming up. The recent attack just a day or two ago on ambulances in the Gaza Strip on the very thin allegation that they were carrying fighters is one recent example. Did this come out of nowhere? Is there no context for this? Let's go back to 2006. So here, and sorry, I should have maybe pointed this out, what I'm trying to establish is that a lot of this discourse has a historical antecedent, okay, where there was a precedent set and the Israeli military got away with it in the end and learned the lesson because they were never punished. So we're seeing those patterns repeat themselves. In 2006, during the Lebanon-Israel war, the Israelis targeted at least 2 ambulances, killing several civilians. They made the same argument. Hezbollah is using human shields. In their view, all groups who oppose it use human shields or misuse emergency vehicles. At the time, the incident generated press coverage, but it didn't result in any punishment or sanction. Hence, its reoccurrence now. Now, when we think also about targeting and the disproportionate number of civilian casualties, and I use the word disproportionate even as a legal point too, this ability or permission for the Israeli military to strike broadly has its roots in an earlier incident. So, in 2002, the Israeli military conducted an airstrike in the Gaza Strip on the house of a fellow called Salah Ashhadi, who was the founder of the Qassam Brigades, the founder of the military wing of the Hamas movement. The airstrike killed him, but it also killed 14 civilians who happened to be in the house with him, including his wife and children. At the time, in 2002, even the United States in the George W. Bush administration condemned the strike. But there was no penalty, there was no repercussion, there was no sanction. And so the message was clear about what was permissible. Further, while it is true that taking hostages is against the laws of war, we need to understand the context. In 1998, it was revealed that the Israeli Supreme Court had sanctioned the Israeli practice of holding, in this case it was two individuals from Lebanon, one of whom was a member of Hezbollah, the other wasn't, I don't think. But it sanctioned the prolonged detention of these individuals for use as bargaining chips in a further prisoner exchange with Hezbollah. Okay? So the Israeli Supreme Court sanctioned the practice of holding people to be used in a prisoner exchange further on. If you think that this practice is 5 years old and maybe isn't still in effect, let's point out that in 2019 the practice was extended to corpses, where Palestinians who have been killed by the Israelis are held and their corpses are not returned to their families for burial as bargaining chips for any future type of exchange. Okay? That brings us to the importance of prisoners in this case. Okay? What do Palestinians call their prisoners not the prisoners that they're holding, the prisoners of their own groups, the members of their own groups who are currently detained by the Israelis? They call them Asra, the singular asir, prisoner of war. They don't call them a sejin, someone who's just an inmate or a prisoner. Okay? They don't believe that these are normal inmates in a jail, although the Israeli military treats them as such, and they give them a prison uniform with a number, etc. This is not something to be taken lightly. Remember the case from the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where the Irish nationalist prisoners, the British authorities wanted them to put on a prison uniform. They said, "We refuse." And they said, "Well, you can go naked." So they basically wore a blanket, right? Later, several of these Irish nationalists were so upset with their detention and the fact that the British considered them prisoners that they went on hunger strike, and several died. So this is a critical issue, right? How are these people perceived? They're perceived on the Palestinian side as legitimate prisoners of war. The Israelis consider them all criminals and terrorists, okay? Not to make too fine a point of it, but also the widespread use by the Israelis of something called administrative detention, which sounds relatively sanitized, but is really another way of saying detaining someone without charges, okay, jailing someone without charges. The problem here is that for those of us like myself who would like to use the law as a way of bringing about change, and I had dreams when I went to law school of, working in the human rights field and making the world a better place, you slam kind of hard into the realities of power and the fact that sometimes power doesn't listen, even if you try to make a principled argument. So, for example, there is a law in the United States named after the senator who spearheaded it, the Leahy Law, which says that weapons sent abroad by the U.S. military to other countries' militaries should not be used in the violations of human rights. Okay? That's never been applied against the Israelis, ever. Okay? There's a representative in Congress called Betty McCollum who has repeatedly introduced a law to say that U.S. weapons should not be used for human rights violations in the Holy Land, including, by the way, the use of military detention against children. Remember, Israel is the only country in the world that tries children in a military court. That law has generated some support in Congress, but it's nowhere near close to passing. Okay, so we're stuck in a world where trying to break through and see the Palestinians as a people that are legally entitled to do something about their situation stymied. Okay, We all know the United States and the Israelis reject the idea of armed resistance. What about peaceful resistance? Earlier this year, the State Department spokesperson was asked what is permissible if the Palestinians have any rights to resist. They wouldn't answer. Again, the UN Secretary General Guterres said, it's better if the Palestinians don't use violence. Maybe they need a Gandhi. Thank you for that helpful advice. Okay. When, in 2008, people of the Gaza Strip tried to march toward the borders in a peaceful march, I know that its detractors characterized it as not a peaceful march, but they marched toward the borders of the Gaza Strip in the fence separating them from what was, for most of them, their ancestral homeland, their villages from which they came, and they were shot down in great numbers. Okay, over 200 people were killed, many, many injured. Okay, in the United States in the United States context, we see, even before October 7th of this year, a kind of a crackdown on pro-Palestine advocacy, where, for example, many states, I think it's 36 at last count, 36 of the 50 United States have laws basically preventing people from engaging in the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, okay, which is, whether you agree with it or not, it's a peaceful movement, okay? Now what are we seeing is further crackdown in U.S. universities on the actions of a group called Students for Justice in Palestine to try to basically declare that all their activities are anti-Semitic. So Palestinians are stuck in what I might call a resistance trap. Fight back, be called a terrorist, and get killed in massive numbers, okay? Or peacefully advocate and shut up and be smeared as anti-Semites. The only real choice, it seems, is to celebrate Zionism or be silent. So these are the limits of the law as applied. So at least I've been true to you in telling and giving you the title, The Limits of the Law. But as an animating force, the principles from the American model, due process and respect for human life and human rights in a more universal context, I think those resonate with everybody, and they provide a basis to essentially resist these attacks on Palestinians, and for people to rise up and protest the indiscriminate and brutal Israeli attacks and the unfair targeting and smearing of Palestinian activism. I know the outlook is bleak, but there are signs of hope, as Professor Ariane was pointing out, and I think the world understands the cause is just. Thank you.
So we have a couple of microphones on either side if people would like to line up and perhaps think of some questions. Wadie, thank you for that. I guess my question, if I could start, is about what recourse Palestinians themselves, but also in their advocates have in terms of what is actually possible. Are we talking about lawsuits filed in various states? Are we talking about reverting back to the United Nations, going back to the ICJ, trying to kind of knock on these agencies to try and see whether there's any recourse there? I think one of the takeaways from your comments is the fact that all of these things are so deeply politicized and that it ultimately comes down to a question of power. And so in that sense, is there really a use for international law?
So yes, it's interesting because I think one of the things that I've been kind of struggling with is this idea of
practical effects. How can we make some practical progress? How can we think about ways to advocate that achieve results? Because it seems like all these results are blocked, right? And so, there's and I've also personally, one of the reasons why I gravitated more towards practicing law and then being a law professor, but in the more American context, is because I feel like there is, when you're dealing with a criminal case, the government has to delineate the charges. It has to say what they're accusing this person of. It can't just kind of continually, shift the goalposts. So, that sort of led me away from international law, where I felt kind of cynical and, great power-based, and this kind of, model of, European states fighting with each other. That's what it's meant to kind of protect the interest of those states, not help people who are under occupation achieve liberation. So, there's some signs. I mean, the Center for Constitutional Rights put out a declaration, that people in Congress who are in the United States who are supporting the Israeli attack could be complicit in genocide, and they're putting them on notice. I think that's valuable and that's important to have, take whatever steps. But more than that, I think the action or the real success lies in popular mobilization. And you saw, the recent protests were unprecedented in terms of their open support for Palestinians, despite quite a repressive atmosphere. I can speak from the American context because that's where I was. Despite a pretty oppressive, and especially the media is playing a particularly ugly role in just repeating some of the things that I was talking about. So I think looking to international law to provide us with a kind of a positive result or a victory in the case, that might be asking a little much. But looking at it to kind of help animate the popular support for Palestine as grounded in principles that are, kind of universally applicable, I think that's something that continues to animate things. Because at the end of the day, popular support and, popular legitimacy are what are going to help bring about, justice in this context.
If I could follow up on a different note, one of the things that occurred to me listening to you as you spoke was this idea that all of these things have genealogies, these practices. And in the case of the global war on terror, for instance, we actually saw early on in that kind of early post-9/11 era how much the United States was actually borrowing from Israeli practices that go back to the 1980s and 1990s in terms of the way that the security architecture and the practices in terms of combating terrorism that the US then borrows from. But it seems to be that now, as Israel is kind of embarking on this new campaign in a way that it's also borrowing from the United States practices throughout the last 2 decades. So are we seeing this sort of cyclical thing happening where, for instance, obviously not just in terms of the charge of trying to paint Hamas as ISIS, but even in terms of what the practices and the implications of that, right? What were the practices in terms of the US campaigns in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, and how might that be now used as a way to say these are now normalized, standardized practices that have been used not just by the US, but by many of its allies. And so Israel, in part, is relying on that, borrowing once again.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I'm glad you brought it up. It's a very good point because, there was a period of time in that post-September 11th era in the United States where, because the United States had been engaged in what it called an enhanced interrogation program of, war on terror detainees, the rest of the world called it torture. But it was very interesting to see that a lot of the opposition to the U.S. engaging in this type of torture came from people who cited the Israeli Supreme Court experience. So in 1999, the Israeli Supreme Court issued a decision in a case called the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, I think versus Attorney General or versus the State of Israel. But it basically said that torture is not allowed, okay? And, so the implication was that, here's a state, a democratic state, that has real security problems and has a problem with terrorism, and they're managing to deal with the issue of torture by outlawing it. Isn't that wonderful? Well, you read the opinion, and it says some, torture is bad, etc. All of it, and then you look at the end of it, and it says, of course, in cases of threats to national security, the authorities are allowed to use these techniques. In Israel, they call them moderate physical pressure, right? In the U.S., enhanced interrogation. You get the idea. That's a loophole. I mean, the loophole so big you could drive a truck through it. And sure enough, the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, B'Tselem, another Israeli human rights organization, have documented that the use of torture is routinized and widespread, even in the years, even in the decades since that decision. So, Israel got a lot of publicity from that. And now, like you said, we're seeing this idea that, the U.S. has useful lessons to teach the Israelis about urban warfare. See the Battle of Fallujah and the fight against ISIS in Mosul. I mean, again, I'm sorry. I know you'll have to humor me. I'm not a military strategist. But I refer to that earlier point about the Battle of Algiers, totally missing the point of the movie, right? About how to fight an insurgency. The other thing is, and this is part of the problem when Hamas and the Palestinian movements and the Palestinian groups are so demonized as terrorism, and this idea that you see in U.S. law, they're so tainted by their terroristic activity, right? Any support is material support. Anything they say is not credible, right? And anything they do, they're basically like ISIS. Really? Really? I mean, I hesitate to say more, again, because it's not my area of expertise, but in my limited understanding of national liberation movements or insurgent movements, whatever you want to call them, terrorist groups, my limited understanding of all of this, if they don't have popular support, they don't survive. I mean, ISIS is probably the most unpopular group in human history. I mean, universally condemned. I mean, I'll condemn them. But they were able to stick it out pretty long in Mosul with no support, right? In Fallujah, the people that the U.S. was fighting were, small in number and not popularly supported. They still managed to stick it out. I don't know what lessons can be drawn from that, really. So we're seeing that dynamic. I don't know, how useful it is as a military point, again, not my area, but just as a kind of a understanding of the situation, I don't think it's accurate either, despite all the protestations to the contrary.
So I guess the microphones are roaming around. So if you have a question, just please raise your hand and someone will come with the microphone. Yeah, okay. And if you could please introduce yourself before asking your question.
Hello. My name is Rashid. I'm a student here in Georgetown. I think this topic is really important. I had a question about the law and media. In my opinion, one of the biggest causes of misunderstanding and misinformation is, to a certain extent, by the media. In the past month, we've seen a lot of examples of misinformation and events deliberately taken out of context and articulated in a way to alienate Palestinians, or maybe vice versa. So my question is, shouldn't there be laws to monitor generally the media to this effect?
Well, I mean, thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think the issue you come up with in the United States is, that they're, and in general, I support that laws about disinformation or laws about, I mean, the First Amendment is a pretty powerful a pretty powerful tool, and the media have generally been given a wide berth in terms of what's called libel law, where so the standard is pretty high. You have to actually know that something is false, and when dealing with public figures, you have to know that something is false and actually say it intentionally for there to be any liability. So that would be very hard to regulate. I mean, I think the issue is, again, it comes back to how much popular pressure can be put on the media to change its tune. So, to give you a positive example, in the context of the BBC, you've seen that their tune has changed a little bit. They were very, very hostile and very accepting of all the claims against Palestinians in general. But they've now, they were reporting the story from an entirely Israeli perspective. But as the bombing has gone on, they've changed and focused more on Palestinian suffering. That has to have been a response to the fact that so many people took to the streets in Britain and protested. So I don't know that the answer is a legal one, although I understand the impulse. But I think America is a little bit more difficult, because I feel like there we struggle with the media being oftentimes an extension of the government, especially when it comes to foreign policy. So that's a trickier one. But there, again, not the greatest amount of hope, but little bits of hope.
Question here, front. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Hi, good evening. My name is Mohammed Hamoudi, Palestinian from Jerusalem. First of all, Doctor, I'd like to recognize and full respect to your late father, a true Palestinian icon. The question is about the international law. What is who governs it? What's the body of international law? Because as a Palestinian, all we see from the beginning, international law does not apply to Palestinians. It's governed by the powers of the world to be used at their own, at their own liking or to their own benefit. So from our perspective, why do we care anymore about international law when it doesn't, equate between people? So what is the reference that Palestinians or any other people or any other body, who do they turn to for the application of international law? Is it the UN? Is it anybody? Should we care about it? Or, because from where we sit, it doesn't matter.
So I certainly understand the sentiment, but I think there's a difference between, I think I was saying earlier, I've also been a huge critic of international law for what it, doesn't say, right? Some of the models are reductive and don't really allow for, a kind of a cause or a struggle for self-determination. So I understand that. But let's not confuse the lack of remedy with just dispatching the principle, okay? So here you have to think of it, or at least I think of it, as a basis for establishing a record that what has gone on is wrong. So there have been some actual breakthroughs. They haven't led to any results on the ground, but for example, in 2004, the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, issued an opinion on the illegality of the wall that the Israelis built in the West Bank. Right? Basically, it was a 14 or 15 to 1 decision. The only judge voting against it was the American judge. But the World Court basically states what international law is. And it basically said that the wall is illegal, that settlements are illegal. And it was very clear about that, okay? Now, did that lead to any change on the ground? No, but as a statement of what the world thinks of what international law thinks of our position and the occupation, at least of the territories taken in 1967, it's clear, and it provides a basis, and it's a reference point for further, kind of popular movement, struggle, etc. Is that action on the ground? Well, I mean, No. And I think that's why you see there are Palestinian groups engaged in other means than, invoking international law, but it doesn't mean we should discard it entirely.
I guess if I could follow up a little bit on that, because I appreciated the historical parallels that you were drawing throughout your talk. So maybe asking the question kind of in a different way in terms of what was the role of international law in liberation struggles in Algeria, in Ireland. We could add to that, obviously, apartheid South Africa and elsewhere.
Okay, so in Algeria, didn't really apply, right? I mean, that was in the era of decolonization. The French were a nuclear power on the UN, with a seat on the UN Security Council. They said Algeria was part of France. I mean, international law was kind of not really written for the Algerians who still managed to liberate their country. In Ireland, the British kind of considered that, they consider that that's part of the so-called United Kingdom, right, Northern Ireland. So again, it's interesting because in the United States context, there was a lot of sympathy for the Irish hunger strikers because of the fact that there's so many Irish Americans of Irish descent. But again, it was more of a kind of an international law, I think, played less of a role there as well. And I don't think, as far as I can tell, that the Irish Republican movement, the nationalist movement, made a big kind of highlighted that as part of their struggle. I think, apartheid is different because there was a convention against apartheid. So the anti-apartheid movement had great success in the international arena. But is that what brought down apartheid? No, there were many factors. The fact that the African population of South Africa, the anti-apartheid population of South Africa was overwhelming, right? The white population was much smaller, okay? There were other factors, like the workers' movement was very strong in South Africa, so it could, economically, that wasn't an intentional slip. It economically paralyzed the country. But also there were other factors, like the fact, so why do I bring that up? Palestinians used to be the main kind of non-skilled, I hate to use that phrase, labor in the Israeli economic market, but they've been, they've been largely pushed out. I remember when I lived there in the mid-90s, the Palestinian, kind of construction workers and agricultural workers were largely being replaced by Romanians and Thai workers. And and some Thai workers were actually killed or taken hostage on October 7th, right? So I think the Israelis study these situations and understand the power of, for example, the labor movement. Finally, in the apartheid context, and I don't mean this answer to go on and on, but in the apartheid context, you also had the Cuban military helped, by fighting apartheid South Africa in Angola, where they actually led a campaign that saw apartheid South Africa defeated by by a Cuban army that was staffed largely by people of African origin, which was not just a military defeat, but also a psychological blow to this idea of racial superiority. So international law played a huge part. Plus, by saying that apartheid was a great crime, an international crime, and South Africa couldn't do things like participate in international sporting competitions and was kind of ostracized. But all these factors played a role. So that's why I say let's not completely get rid, even as though I disagree with a lot of the shortcomings of international law. Let's not just let's explore every possible means at our disposal.
Do you have the microphone? Okay.
Good, how are you?
Hey, amazing. My name is Ryan Doremus. So I'm a veteran U.S. Military. Now I'm in the more private sector, doing my own risk management and security. What I was curious on, as from Americans' perspective, is what exactly does it look like now that with Americans' involvement financially, as it may like escalate more, what would the region with Qatar and US be here if the United States starts sending more people here to the Middle East? Because from what I see, a lot of the silent majority in the United States doesn't see or have an emotional connection to what's going on here, and that a lot of people from where I'm from believe that it should be less involvement, where more of the people at the top seem to be more controlling and be more making the decisions to go be more on the opposite. So that's where I'm trying to figure out.
Yes.
Thank you.
Does that
Sorry,
make
maybe we
sense?
can take a few more questions just so that we can get through more, because I know there are a lot of hands out there. So why don't we take another question, some from this side as well?
Okay. Did you want to answer that one? Like, what would the relationships look like with the U.S. and Qatar if more escalation starts on the American side?
Okay, thank
Go
you. Do we have another microphone on this side? Okay, please go ahead.
So, hi, my name is Al-Jazi. I'm a law student, and I have kind of a long question. So, so like I said, I'm a law student, but every time I study law in theory, it's great, but in practice, it's really demotivating and depressing. So my question is, we learned that international law functions by the will of states, and the states that have the most decisional power, as we know in the UN and in the world, are the countries who are complicit to this genocide and the ongoing occupation. So what would make them willing to act, if not the law? And we know boycotting is significant, but will the popular opinion really change and put pressure on these governments? And if Israel is prosecuted or tried for its crimes against humanity, then who are we going to try? Because as you've mentioned, that the allies and the countries that are complicit to this genocide have also committed these actions. So who are you going to prosecute and who are you not going to? So do you even see a future where states actually are accountable for their crimes, or are we living in a dystopian era?
Okay. All right. Maybe I'll just say a few things and then we get some more. Is that
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So trying to, answer or try to opine on both of those questions. I mean, I think it's terrifying to think that the United States response to all this is to send aircraft carriers and nuclear-armed submarines to this region. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's terrifying, and I don't know what it means for relations between the United States and other countries in the region, other than I'm particularly worried about that. I think that as far as Americans have spoken, it seems to be against, an escalation and more towards a ceasefire. So I'm hopeful that that's what's going to happen. I don't have any, I don't have any basis for predicting other than to say that the initial signs of popular mobilization at home against, in favor of a ceasefire are heartening, sort of ending violence. But there are also very worrying signs, for sure. Now, with respect to the question about law, who to prosecute, again, the nature of the sort of international order, the international legal order, is very, so the Biden administration, at least on this front, is not the most extreme. If you saw it under the Trump administration, they were so upset by the idea that the International Criminal Court would even consider investigating Israeli practices in the West Bank and Gaza, even more so investigating the United States actions in Afghanistan, that they placed sanctions on the ICC prosecutor at the time and some of her senior staff. So she was denied her visa to the United States was canceled, and then she was subject to further sanctions. Like if she had any assets in the United States, they were frozen. So that's an extreme reaction, but that can happen, right? So I think the idea of holding people accountable for crimes. It's difficult when nation states that enjoy sovereignty and enjoy the protection of other states, right? It's difficult in that context to think about holding people accountable. I mean, the United States has said many times what they think of the leadership of Iran and how they'd like to see them all, eliminated, or how they're all a bunch of criminals or something. But even the US, which calls Iran a state sponsor of terrorism, hasn't been able to hold them accountable. So I think looking in those terms about, holding people accountable, and thinking of this as like a potential for criminal action, I'm not so hopeful. Because a lot of the experiences we have, like the former Rwanda tribunal, the former Yugoslavia tribunal, I don't know what the Sierra Leone tribunal, they held some people accountable, but they ultimately sowed more discord than they resolved things. So I don't know. I wish I had a better answer. But I don't see it in the immediate future as a possibility, and I don't know, I don't want to sound like a kind of a, too much of a utopian idealist, but the South Africans had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Did it resolve anything? I don't know. Some South Africans will say their situation is, worse than ever, although they just won the Rugby World Cup and they think that's going to bring them together, so who knows. But I actually read that. I didn't make that up. But I do think that at least there was a real reckoning with the crimes of the apartheid era, an attempt to reckon with it. Maybe that's something to think about in the future. But it's a pretty bitter moment now, so I understand.
In the front.
Thank you, Professor, for your very informative lecture. I would like to ask an odd question. According to international law, when a group of people cross the borders of another country, attack villages, civilians, killing or taking hostages, etc., according to international law, this is called terrorism, described as terrorists. What about in the case of the people of the Palestinian factions in Gaza? You know that in Gaza, 75% of the people there are refugees. Where did they come from? They came from the areas which is surrounding Gaza, where these people crossed the borders and went to. So they went back to their land, to their homes. They are still carrying the keys in their pockets. So how does the international describe these people? They are the same as other criminals who come from, I don't know where, and kill. And another point, the international law, how can it be of a benefit when we find a state behaving as a state above law and being protected fully by the international powers, mainly the United States and Europe, and not allowed, anybody not allowed to put Israel accountable for anything? So where is the credibility here? Thank you.
Okay.
Got a couple in the back as well.
Hello, Professor Said, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Sami Hermez. I'm at Northwestern University in Qatar. So I have a question, just maybe sort of And I'm reminded by calling you Professor Said 21 years ago, and anyway, we'll talk. I wanted to ask you about and push you a little bit, because I really loved what you said early in your talk about intentionality versus knowing. And I'd like to just push you on that to see how we could think the law differently, as you were starting to suggest. I mean, it was new to me when you said that, that intent is the highest crime in a sort of domestic murder, but also the crime of genocide requires intent, and that's the highest crime. But that it made, something clicked when you said that actually you could argue that the Israelis know they're killing civilians, but do not intend to kill civilians, right? I mean, whatever anyone else in this room thinks, but that could be a form of argument. So, but then you have a case where I can knowingly kill 10,000 civilians without intent. At the same time, I can prove to you that Hamas, who kills 5 civilians, has an intent to kill all Jews, right? And so that, seems, if we go, so I was just curious how you would even begin to start to sort of rethink that.
Can we just do one more? Last
Okay.
question here, Nadia.
Hello, hi, thank you. Nadia Speiti, I teach Middle East history here. And actually my question overlaps with Sami's, which is basically that as far as I understand it, intent is one of the hardest things to prove in international court around genocide. But I would argue that the Israeli government and the military have been actually providing us with intent, with all of their statements actually show intent. So I'm wondering how this might actually be helpful moving forward and actually crafting a case of genocide in the future. Thanks.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. So, let me speak to this point. I think to both of the questions and comments there about intentionality. I mean, so just to back up a little bit and kind of give you an idea. There are all sorts of examples in like the criminal law casebook of, law professors love this stuff. They love the idea that, there's a guy who, really wants to blow up a building and he knows that people will be in it, but he sets the bomb off anyway. He doesn't want to kill them. He doesn't have the intention, but he does it anyway. And it's a stupid exercise, but the purpose of it that, a lot of law professor casebook authors like to point out is that there's a difference between intentional, behavior, purposeful behavior, and knowing behavior. And the culpability is less, okay? And I think, first of all, I'm not convinced that the intention is not there, right? I think that that's really, I think that at some point you pass the line of knowing into intentionality, and I think the Israeli military is hidden a lot behind these obfuscations, which are becoming, I think, for those of us who pay attention and have a conscience, they're becoming unbearable, right? It's becoming unbearable to watch this. So it's not so much that I feel like, you need to push me in any direction, right? Because I think this is one of those situations where the law has a standard that, in most instances kind of can make sense in this sort of individual killing, right? But when you have a political conflict and when issues of, peoplehood are in the balance, I do agree that it's not a useful distinction. And I don't think intentionality can be that hard to prove when you start looking at what Israeli leaders say. So I'm also glad for these remarks because I wanted to mention this in the talk, Abdullah, but I hope I can just take a second here. One of the things that has been striking and again, this is a point I really wanted to make. I just couldn't figure out how to fit it in, so I'm glad that you have this opportunity to do so, if you'll just indulge me. But one of the things you've heard Israeli leaders say is that they say to American and European audiences, you firebombed Dresden. You killed 600,000 civilians. We have to do the same type of thing, right? The British ambassador the Israeli ambassador to Britain said that on TV, okay? When the former Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, was interviewed on Sky News, which is a very, 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 sympathetic to Israeli forum. He was early on, sort of in the first week after October 7th. And already it was clear that there was a problem with killing lots of Palestinian civilians and a humanitarian crisis. So the anchor for Sky News very gingerly asked him, well, what about Palestinian civilians? And he started screaming at him, how dare you ask me about Palestinian civilians? These are Nazis, right? The implication being, right, that what was done to the Nazis in terms of total destruction is okay in this case. The whole point of the Geneva Conventions, right, the Fourth Geneva Convention passed in 1949 on the treatment of civilians in war, was to ensure that nothing like World War II ever happened again. So it's kind of almost nonsensical. It's illegal, not just illegal, but it was a state of the world where the laws of war didn't apply, and yet they're doing it openly. And in fact, Bennett, well before this, is the author of a famous statement where he said, I've killed a lot of Arabs in my time and there's no problem with that, okay? So to the extent that these statements are out there and the call for another Dresden, treating Gaza like Dresden and firebombing it, that goes completely against the whole thrust of international law after World War II. So it's kind of, the reason why I want to bring this up and highlight it is because it is kind of crazy to say that when you're talking about the potential of charges of genocide, which many people have credibly brought up. And it seems like they're kind of tailor-making the case for it. So it's something to consider, it's something to consider, even not even getting into the history of, just the bigger history of, the context, which former President Obama brought up in a kind of a nothing statement recently and was still attacked by Republican members of Congress for saying that. Even not dealing with the context and the history here, it's still a chilling record. So I think I also brought up the point about knowing versus intentionally to show that it kind of doesn't really apply here, even though lots of international lawyers insist on that distinction. So I was trying to make that sort of argument.
And then maybe just this last question before we wrap up.
Okay.
If you remember the question we got from the front row.
Oh, I did, yeah.
Okay.
I talked about it.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, we are out of time then, so if you could please join me in thanking Professor Said.
Yeah.